Hey guys, imagine waking up to the roar of artillery as your alarm clock, the jungle outside your foxhole smelling like burnt coconut and fear. That's the opening line of a Marine's private memoir from Guadalcanal. Before we dive into this gritty diary, smash that like button if you love a good dose of raw history, and drop a comment with your favorite war movie so we can argue about which one gets the most accurate battle scenes. Now dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a cold beer, and picture yourself stuck in 1942. Sweltering under a sun that feels like a furnace on a skillet. You hear cicadas buzzing like nervous gossip, feel the mud sucking your boots as if the island itself is trying to swallow you whole, and smell the acrid tang of gunpowder mingling with salty sea air. The only thing scarier than the Japanese Zero screaming overhead is the thought that your rations consist of canned beans that taste like cardboard with a side of existential dread. Talk about a culinary nightmare. So stay with me, because every page of this memoir is a cocktail of heroism, absurdity, and the kind of raw truth that makes your Netflix binge look like a warm-up act. The landing craft hissed like a wounded dragon as we shoved onto the sand of Guadalcanal, and my stomach did flip-flops between terror and the kind of reckless excitement you only get from a first roller coaster ride. The jungle ceiling draped thick green over us, a living ceiling that drummed with cicadas and the distant thrum of engines that smelled like salt, diesel, and a hint of burnt rubber. Henderson Field rose in the distance, a scar of concrete that promised flights and the illusion of safety, like a stolen promise scribbled on a napkin. We were handed rifles that felt heavier than our doubts, and the sun beat down on our helmets with a brutal, unapologetic glare. Lieutenant Moore stepped out of the shadows with eyes as steady as a metronome, his uniform crisp against the muck, and he barked orders that felt oddly comforting, like a dad yelling, "Watch the pot," while the kitchen burned down. Corporal Reyes, a lanky kid from the Bronx with a grin that could disarm a bomb, cracked jokes about the jungle being nature's version of a teenager's bedroom, messy, noisy, and full of surprises to keep the ghosts at bay. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the faint sour tang of fear, and rumors slithered through the camp like jungle vines, each whisper about Japanese positions adding another layer to the map we could never quite read. We learned the lay of the land by stumbling on rope-marked trails and listening to the distant pop of mortars, realizing that the only thing maps failed to mark was the ominous rustle behind every leaf. That night, under a lantern that flickered like a dying firefly, I pulled out a battered notebook and began a private ledger, a secret memoir where I could wrestle with the tug of duty and the sharp, sudden homesickness that gnawed at my ribs. The lantern's amber glow painted my cramped bunk in a warm hue, making the scarred wooden floor look almost poetic, while outside the jungle sang a chorus of croaking frogs and distant gunfire. I wrote about the way the humidity clung to my skin, how the rations tasted like cardboard with a side of regret, and how each order felt like a silent movie where I was both the hero and the extra. In those pages, I tried to capture the ironies of war, the way a joke could mask a scream, and how a single leaf could feel like a world-shaking omen. The night over Guadalcanal looked like a bad fireworks show, tracer ribbons stitching the black sky in neon red and green. Below, the ridge that guarded the airstrip glowed like a furnace, the sand melting under a barrage of Japanese mortars that cracked the night like thunderous applause. Orders roared from the foxhole chain of command, each shout swallowed by the roar of shells and the scream of metal on metal. Our line wavered, men slipping into the mud as if the ground itself wanted a ticket out of this hell. Somewhere a radio crackled frantic pleas for reinforcements, the voice sounding as helpless as a teenager trying to order pizza during a blackout. In that chaos, I made a decision that felt like stepping onto a movie set where I was both the hero and the stunt double. I slipped out of the scant cover, the air thick with cordite and the smell of burnt coconut, and crawled toward a crater where Corporal Reyes lay half buried in his own blood. I yanked him up, his uniform a soggy canvas, and hauled him through a river of fire that turned night into day in a single breath. Behind us, Lieutenant Moore snarled commands, his jaw set as he held the collapsing flank like a stubborn door hinge that refused to give. Shrapnel sang past us like a broken ukulele, each splinter of metal, a reminder that bravery often comes wrapped in cheap, rusted irony. The Japanese launched a desperate charge, a wave of silhouettes that surged like a bad sequel to Saving Private Ryan. A flamethrower belched orange death, licking the brush and turning the ridge into a giant, angry incense burner. In the split second between two roaring explosions, I felt the world pause, the heat on my skin sharpening into a crystal-clear focus. Reyes slipped from my grip, his eyes wide with shock, and I cradled his head as his life puddled into the mud, the raw grief tasting like iron and salt. Yet even as his body grew still, a cold, ironclad clarity settled over me, survival, in this theater of hell, is a cruelly efficient scriptwriter. When the night fire died, Guadalcanal settled into a slower, sour cruelty that tasted like wet mud and rusted steel. Supply ships prowled the horizon like wary beasts, their horn-blowing engines a distant growl that promised more rations but never delivered on time. Malaria turned the strongest grunt into a trembling shadow, his skin slick with sweat and fevers that made the night feel like a furnace. Coffee, rationed to the point of being a sacrament, smelled like burnt hope, and we swapped jokes for bandages as if humor could stitch the gaping holes in our morale. Orders drifted in and out like the tide, each one reshaped by the jungle's fickle whims. The obstacles piled up like the overturned sandbags we tried to move with busted hands. A stretcher party arrived late, their canvas bunched and their faces expressionless, as if they'd been hired by a ghost. A stray bombardment hit our own foxhole, showering us with shrapnel that sang a metallic lullaby we wished we could sleep through. Rumors that home had moved on, kids with new names, mothers with new faces, slipped through the trenches like gossip in a church pew, gnawing at resolve. My ledger grew heavier with names and whispered confessions, while night sweats brought back the ghost of Ray's, his laughter echoing every time I woke. The men counted the days not by sunrise, but by the stub of a cigarette clenched between trembling fingers. Japanese counterattacks began to probe our thin line, their rifles cracking in the humid night like angry cicadas. Our commanders argued over whether to withdraw like a retreating tide or to hold the line with the stubbornness of a stubborn mule. Every decision felt like choosing between a busted jeep and a sinking raft. Both would get us wet, but one might get us killed faster. The scent of cordite mixed with the swamp's decay, and the mud clung to our boots like a second skin that refused to come off. In those moments I realized I wasn't being tested by a single battle, but by the endurance of a soul under siege, a soul that kept asking, do I still have a reason to laugh? The chopper's rotors tore the humid night sky like a busted vinyl record, jerking me from the muck that had clung to my boots for months. I stared down at the island's silhouette receding beneath me, the scent of burned jungle and cordite fading into a faint, oily aftertaste. Back on home soil, newspapers shouted victory like a fireworks show, yet no headline could summon the name of Ray's or the kid who buried his lunch in a sandbag. I felt the weight of a country that loves a trophy, but forgets the hands that lifted it. In the sterile medevac ward, the only thing that sounded louder than the beeping monitors was the echo of my own heartbeat, a drumbeat of return and reckoning. In my duffel I cradled 3 relics: Ray's dog tag, tarnished like a relic from a pirate movie, a crumpled photograph of us grinning under a busted canopy, the smile warped by sweat and sand, and the leather-bound ledger that began on Guadalcanal, its pages stained with rain, blood, and nicknamed jokes about the longest Tuesday. Each item throbbed with a story, a punchline waiting to be told to anyone who'd listen. I thumped the ledger shut, feeling the weight of every name etched in ink that tasted of gunpowder and coffee. The packet felt like an alchemical mix, memory, guilt, and the stubborn hope that I could still make sense of the chaos. I set the trio on my kitchen table, where the fluorescent light flickered like a nervous director's cue. The memoir became my altar, a battered notebook where I scribbled letters to families who never got a postcard and whispered apologies to strangers at the bar in exchange for a cold beer. I walked to the old cemetery, the grass whispering under my shoes, and knelt beside graves that looked like potholes in a battlefield of stone. I confessed to a teenage veteran, half amused, half hushed, that I once hid behind a coconut tree while a buddy scooped up a sandbag for a heroic charge, an act that felt as cowardly as a sitcom character flubbing his lines. The irony was delicious. I offered the world my darkest moments like a confessional booth with a broken door. In each telling, the mud from the island seeped out of me, replaced by a dry, honest wind that smelled of pine needles and fresh ink. I cracked the battered notebook open on the blistering shore of Peleliu, the pages already sweating under a sun that felt like a furnace set to 120 degrees. The white glare off broken coral shards turned the beach into a giant disco ball, scattering light in jagged patterns that danced on my visor. Behind me, the surf thumped against the reef like a drum roll for war, each crash sending salty spray into my nostrils and a metallic tang of fear. Somewhere ahead, the staccato pop of incoming fire cracked the air, snapping the silence like a misplaced cue in a war movie. Lieutenant Alvarez strutted onto the sand with the swagger of a drill sergeant who'd watched too many westerns, shouting orders that sounded like they were ripped straight from a video game tutorial. His squad, stubborn as mules and twice as noisy, hunched behind a mangrove that was more thorn than leaf, snickering about the heat as if it were a prank. Medic Morris, forever polishing his field kit like a Boy Scout, whispered jokes about sunscreen for the soul while checking our pulse points that felt more like drum beats. I sketched the eye-catching ridges of coral that rose like a jagged crown, noting how nature had turned this island into a natural fortress before the enemy even saw it. The Japanese position stayed hidden behind a veil of green scrub and the overhanging coral, invisible until a burst of machine gun fire lit them up like fireworks on the 4th of July, only far less celebratory. The bullets sang a hot, rasping chorus, tearing into the sand and scattering broken shells that smelled of burnt cordite and diesel. Heat waves rose from the ground, making the air shimmer like a bad hologram, while the sting of sweat dripped into my eyes, turning everything into a blur of brown and white. Every step we took felt like wading through a sauna while dodging shrapnel that whispered, "You're next," in a tone only war can perfect. The sun bled red over the coral ridge like a busted lantern, and we knew the day would end in gravel and blood. Mercer's pen scratched frantic notes as the squad slipped into the jagged trench, the air thick with the sour bite of gunpowder and salty sea spray. Alvarez's cheekbone cracked when a burst of Japanese fire sliced the air, and he fell, clutching his side as if the world itself had turned into a hot skillet. The rhythm of our boots on broken coral sounded like a death metal drum solo, each thump echoing off the limestone walls. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next scream to break the monotony of war. We crawled under a hail of lead, the sky a canvas of tracer fire that painted our faces with orange ghosts. Mercer's notebook recorded the smell of scorched cordite mingling with the faint perfume of crushed coral, a perfume no perfume salesman would ever dare bottle. Suddenly a grenade erupted against the reef, its hiss a serpentine whisper that curled around our ears before shattering the stone into a spray of glittering dust. In the chaos, I wrestled a Japanese soldier hand to hand, feeling his sweat mix with the brine as we tangled like two toddlers fighting over a broken toy. The irony was not lost on me. Here we were, playing a real-life video game where the only extra life was a fresh corpse. A desperate charge erupted, our rifles roaring as we slammed into the enemy line like a busted subway train at rush hour. The squad split the enemy's defenses, shrapnel spitting like fireworks on the 4th of July, but the cost was a gut-wrenching silence when Hal Reeves went down, his body crumpling into the coral like a misplaced prop. Mercer wrote his death in clinical, almost bored detail, then added a single raw line that read, "Reeves died," and the world stopped humming a little less loudly. The reef echoed with the clang of metal and a distant, mournful wail that seemed to ask why we were there at all. We pressed forward, half-heartedly cheering like we'd just won a sudden death overtime, but the victory felt as hollow as a busted coconut. When the last Japanese mortar cracked the ridge, the fight didn't end. It turned into a slog that felt like a marathon in a sauna. Sweat soaked through our wool end uniforms, turning them into clingy, salty sheets that clung to our skin like a second, itchy layer. Rations trickled like a leaky faucet, and every bite of canned pork tasted like cardboard soaked in desert dust. Yet the ridge still glimmered in the distance, a stubborn prize that kept our boots moving forward over the blistering sand. The island's belly was a maze of coral tunnels and limestone caves, each dark mouth yawning like the jaws of an ancient sea monster. We heard the echo of our own footsteps bounce off the wet walls, only to be answered by a sudden spray of gunfire from a hidden position, ambushes that felt ripped straight from a video game, stealth mode gone terribly wrong. The air stank of brine and decay, a cocktail of seaweed, blood, and the sour bite of rusted metal. Every turn could hide a predator or a friend, so we learned to trust the click of a compass over the whisper of our own nerves. When a comrade went down on a jagged coral slab, the world narrowed to a painful crawl, dragging a body that smelled of seawater, copper, and fear. The corrosion ate at our gear. M16s turned green, boots blistered, and the waterproof map turned into a soggy mess that fluttered like a wounded bird. Between hauling the wounded and hoarding the last tin of chocolate, we faced tiny moral battles. Do we push the line or pause to patch a mangled arm? Those decisions piled up like sand in a boot, heavy enough to make a man question why he even signed up for a war that smelled like an overcooked shrimp boil. The night air finally slipped over the deck, cool enough to make my sweat-slick shirt cling like an unwanted souvenir. Below us, the island's coral still glowed in the dying light, sharp as broken glass and still biting the soles of my boots as if it remembered the sun's scorch. I could still hear the distant thump of artillery like a bad bass line from a 1970s sci-fi movie, a reminder that the war's soundtrack never truly fades. My notebook, already stained with mud and shell fragments, felt heavier than a heart attack-inducing pizza box. I scribbled the date, and the feeling that the world had turned into a giant humid sauna where every breath tasted of salt and fear. We dug a shallow grave on a lonely spit of coral, its jagged ribs jutting out like the teeth of a sea monster that had swallowed our innocence. The sand was sticky with blood, and the wind carried the metallic scent of fresh wounds and stale cigarettes. Alvarez, who had been knocked out cold by shrapnel, surged back to life when we hosed him with seawater, coughing up brine and disbelief. Hal, however, was nowhere to be seen. His empty bunk stared at us like a ghost waiting for a sequel that never got green-lighted. We slipped a faded photograph of his grin under the coral lid, a silent joke that even death can't delete a good meme. As the moon rose, I pocketed a sliver of fossilized coral that the tide had polished smooth by blood and sand, its surface cool as a Jedi's lightsaber after a battle. The stone felt oddly comforting, like having a tiny, prickly superhero cape sewn into my uniform. I laughed to myself, thinking that the universe must have a twisted sense of humor, giving us a souvenir that looks like the set prop from Jurassic Park, but smells like a wet dog. Every time the wind rattled the ship's rigging, the talisman rang against my chest, reminding me that survival is part luck, part grit, and part absurdity. I wrote down the moment, promising that anyone who reads these pages will understand that the smallest shard can carry the weight of a whole front line. I sit on a wedge of black sand that grinds like a cheap record player under my boots, and I can taste sulfur on the wind, as if the island itself were roasting marshmallows. I'm Samuel Hale, your lovesick corpsman, typing this cramped letter with a pencil that's seen more mud than a Boy Scout badge. The volcanic ridges loom like skeletal backs, their shadows flickering across the sea of men who shuffle forward like pixelated avatars in an old arcade game. I promise, Anna, that each line will be as honest as the heat that makes my head feel like a toaster. If you ever wondered what war smells like, think of burnt rubber mixed with fresh rain on hot ash. We've dug a makeshift aid station in a shell crater that still rings with the echo of artillery, its walls plastered with sandbags, and a stray dog tailgate that serves as a triage board. The wounded crawl in, some clutching limbs that look more like broken branches than flesh, others mumbling prayers that sound like bad karaoke. I hand out the last 3 bandages like a miser handing out quarters, while a lanky sergeant offers me a stale pork rind as a thank you, the only thing that isn't gray. The men are ragged, their uniforms stained with the same mud that sticks to my boots, but their eyes still flash a stubborn spark. Even the crickets seem to cheer, as if the island itself is rooting for the underdogs. Impossible wounds arrive daily, a shrapnel wound that slices through a shoulder like a sushi knife, a blast lung that feels like someone shoved a garden hose into a chest, and a broken morale that no gauze can patch. I'm forced into a brutal arithmetic, weighing who gets the scarce cotton and who gets a prayer, as if I were playing a twisted game of Who Wants to Be a Surgeon. I jot the dates in the margin, hoping the numbers will keep the chaos from eating my mind. Anna, I swear to you I'll write the truth, not the sanitized version the Army's censors love to garnish with patriotic glitter. If that makes me sound like a gritty anti-hero from a 1970s war flick, so be it, I'm just trying to stay human. Under a waning moon, I sit on a sand-blasted ridge, lantern trembling like a nervous firefly. The night the men later call the night of 30 fires has just scalded our souls, and I'm scrawling this letter with a stubby pencil and grease-stained hands. Somewhere behind me the surf hisses, but up here the air smells of cordite, burnt oil, and the sour bite of my own sweat. I can still hear the distant drum of Japanese artillery, a metronome ticking toward chaos. If you think this sounds like a war movie, you'd be right, except the popcorn is replaced by sand, and the hero's badge is a battered field kit. The enemy launched a wave of men that turned the darkness into a fireworks display of tracer rounds, each streak a silver ribbon slicing the night. The sound was a chorus of whines and shrieks, like a metal symphony performed by 1,000 broken guitars. Our trench became a furnace as flames licked the dunes, casting a hellish glow on bodies that looked like twisted kelp. I was forced to sprint from one wounded comrade to another, the lantern in my hand wobbling like a nervous director's megaphone. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with the acrid tang of gasoline, and every breath felt like inhaling a war zone perfume. In the chaos I found Private Harris, his leg mangled by a shrapnel bite that was bleeding faster than a leaky faucet. With no scalpel, I grabbed a rusted bayonet and improvised a field amputation, the blade singing against bone as I prayed the tide wouldn't rise before the bleeding stopped. Next, Sergeant Mad Dog Collins, shell-shocked, eyes wide as saucers, needed stitches. I jabbed thread through his shirt like a mad tailor, each pull a punchline to the universe's cruel joke. While I was stitching, my best friend Tommy slipped into unconsciousness, his blood pooling like a dark puddle on the sand. I held him as if he were a live wire, feeling his pulse flicker and die. With his last breath, he whispered a note for his mother, and I swore on my battered hat to deliver it, even if the sea ate my boots. The heat after Iwo Jima clings like a wet blanket, and the corpsman's ledger fills with feverish names. In the humid dusk, maggots waltz under bandages, and wounds that were fresh yesterday now fester with a sour, bile-stained stench. Supplies of antiseptic run thin, so Sam mixes rainwater with a pinch of salt, praying the mixture won't taste like the sea. Every night the jungle sings cicadas, while wounded men cough up sputum that smells like burnt oil. I write home about the infections blooming like poisonous flowers, each one a reminder that death doesn't end at the wire. Just when we think the tide might turn, the convoy of supply ships stalls out at sea, stuck behind a bureaucratic knot thicker than a battleship's hull. The order from higher up reroutes every stretcher away from Sam's sector, as if the wounded were parcels to be shipped to the wrong address. With each missed pallet, the medics improvise, slinging makeshift litters made from sandbags and discarded helmets. The rain turns the trench floors into slick mud, and the sound of distant artillery becomes a metronome for our growing desperation. I scribble in my letter that the only thing arriving faster than the paperwork is the gossip about who got the last tin of coffee. The men we tend now wear scars that no rifle could etch, and their eyes are locked on a horizon only they can see. They mutter about the things they saw, but the words get tangled like barbed wire, leaving us to read the silence in their clenched fists. Evacuation drags on, slower than a dial-up internet connection, and each hour feels like an eternity of throbbing pulse and stale blood. My own hands shake from sleepless nights, the calluses turning pink from raw nerves, while my heart beats a rhythm of guilt and resolve. I confess to my aunt that I've started counting the number of times a patient coughs up a bullet fragment, just to prove I'm still breathing. The last night the sand turned to ash, Sam pulled out a battered field kit like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. Only the rabbit was a bundle of gauze and a half-cracked bottle of ether. He set up a makeshift operating table on a crater that smelled of cordite and burnt oil, the clatter of mortars a metronome for his scalpel. Under a sky that flickered with tracer fire, he stitched together the guts of 3 men whose radios had died louder than any pop song chorus. Each incision was a quiet joke to fate. "You think you've seen horror," he muttered, wiping blood with a glove that had seen better days. By sunrise, the wounded lay breathing, the air thick with the metallic perfume of blood and hope. When Private Alvarez went down, his soul didn't stay behind, it rode the wind in a soggy notebook Sam found tucked between a busted canteen and a broken harmonica. Sam promised the dead boy's words would reach home, so he slipped the crumpled pages into a courier's satchel, sealing it with a dab of mud like a wedding ring for the fallen. The courier, a lanky Marine with a shaved head and a Beatles tattoo, chuckled, "I'm your post office now, Doc, delivering love letters from the front line of hell." The letter arrived at Sam's mother's doorstep, with the scent of gunpowder still clinging to the paper, making her gasp as if she'd just read a horror novel set in a kitchen. In that odd, bittersweet delivery, the dead found a voice louder than any battlefield shout. Just as Sam slipped the last note into his pocket, a stray shell kicked up shrapnel that kissed his forearm, turning his own blood into a crimson ink he hadn't asked for. He winced, feeling the sting of iron and regret, and the medics hoisted him onto a rusted ambulance that looked more like a coffin on wheels. The ride jolted over cratered earth, the engine coughing like an old smoker, while distant explosions turned the night into a chaotic fireworks show, only less festive. From the stretcher, Sam watched his own battlefield turn into a hallway of stained blankets, the smell of antiseptic battling the lingering aroma of diesel. The evacuation gave him a high-altitude view of the island, a bird's eye that let him see the patterns of pain he'd tried to stitch together. Petty Officer Samuel Reed steadies himself on the wet deck of the USS Riptide, a sleek destroyer that has earned more dents than a bowling alley in a hurricane. Beneath his hammock lies a battered ledger, its pages as cramped as a sardine can and as stubborn as a mule, where he promises to jot down the truth before the Navy can encrypt it into oblivion. The night sky over Guadalcanal hangs heavy with humidity, making the air smell like brine mixed with burnt rubber, an olfactory reminder that the Pacific isn't a place for dainty perfumes. Reed can hear the distant thrum of the ship's engines, a low growl that syncs with his own heartbeat, as if the vessel were a living beast waiting for his command. With a wry grin, he mutters that keeping a log here feels like trying to write a diary for a superhero who can't fly but can certainly sputter under fire. As twilight drapes the sea, convoys slip through the water like ghosts on a covert mission, their hulls cloaked in blackout, meaning every light is snuffed out to deny enemy spotters a shiny target. The horizon flickers with the orange glow of distant artillery on Guadalcanal, a reminder that the island's guns never truly sleep, and occasional silhouettes of burning ships paint a macabre fireworks display. The scent of diesel mingles with the salty spray, and the occasional hiss of a torpedo launch cuts through the night like a pop song's needle skip, unsettling yet oddly rhythmic. Reed watches the silhouettes of troop transports shuffle past, their decks piled high with men, ammo, and the ever-present promise of more mess hall leftovers. He can't help but think of a late-night drive-in movie, except the trailers are steel hulls and the popcorn is replaced by the crackle of flak. Chief Martin Hayes, a hulking man with a laugh that could shatter glass, pilots the main gun with the precision of a seasoned violinist, except his bow is a 5-inch cannon, and his music is the roar of powder. Young Ensign Robert Keene, fresh out of the academy and still clutching his polished brass buttons, fumbles with the radar like he's trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark. Signalman Elias Morales taps out messages in Morse code with the speed of a caffeinated typist, his fingers dancing on the telegraph like a DJ scratching vinyl. And then there's Smitty, the irrepressible cook who somehow manages to fry fish on a galley stove while the ship rocks like a tossed salad, always tossing in a joke about seafood cuisine. Now with extra hull bite, together they form a ragtag band that could rival any sitcom cast, bound by the shared terror of night watches and the comfort of stale coffee. The night fell like a black curtain over the Solomons, the stars hidden and the moon a rumor nobody could confirm. Our radar, that humming, beeping heart of the destroyer, sang a frantic alarm as green blips multiplied into hostile silhouettes. The convoy, a string of lumbering cargo ships and fuel barges, suddenly seemed a rabbit in a gunner's sight, their tinny engines whining under the weight of desperation. I could smell the salty, oily breath of the sea mixing with the acrid scent of diesel, as the Riptide's decks thrummed with nervous anticipation. At the signal, Riptide snapped her helm like a rattlesnake, tearing through the inky water with a spray of frothy foam. Smoke generators roared, cloaking us in a ghostly veil that choked the eyes of the enemy and made the deck feel like a sauna gone berserk. The night erupted as flares shot up, blooming like dying stars and painting the blackness with orange and white, while the muzzle flashes of our guns carved jagged lines into the darkness. The hull shuddered under near misses that sounded like the world was being hammered, each thud reverberating up the spine of every sailor on board. In the maelstrom, Chief Hayes barked orders that cut through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel, his voice steady even as splintered wood and hot metal rained down. Ensign Keene, fresh out of the academy but already looking like a teenage James Bond, rallied the gun crews with a calm that made us wonder if he'd secretly swallowed a Zen tea. Elias, tangled in a knot of shouting men and tangled lines, sprinted back and forth, his radio crackling with frantic whispers that sounded like a nervous squirrel. Meanwhile, Smitty lugged bandages, painkillers, and a repertoire of terrible jokes. What do you call a ship that can't sink? A flotation device that somehow steadied trembling hands and kept the morale from breaking like a cheap rope. The destroyer lurches between the jagged silhouettes of the Solomon Islands like a wounded tiger too tired to pounce. Her hull, pocked with shrapnel scars, groans under the weight of salty spray and the faint, sour scent of oil that never quite washes off. Reed writes in a measured hand, noting how repair parties dart across the deck with hammers in one hand and rope in the other, all while the engine sputters on a last-minute prayer. Even the wind seems to sigh, as if urging the ship to rest, but orders to keep moving crackle over the intercom like a broken jukebox. The crew's eyes are bloodshot, their jokes as thin as the dwindling stores, yet they push forward because stopping would mean inviting the enemy a night on their doorstep. Rations become the new battlefield. A stale biscuit can spark a mutiny louder than a torpedo hit. Hayes, with the stealth of a cat burglar, slips a steaming thermos of coffee to a gunner whose hands tremble like a jittery arcade joystick, and the man swears the brew is liquid courage. Meanwhile, Keene stays aloft past midnight, clambering up the mast to wrestle a jammed gun mount, while the rest of the crew snore in hammocks that smell of sweat and seaweed. Their petty disputes over who ate the last mango slice dissolve into laughter when someone's helmet slides off and rolls like a rogue bowling ball into the galley. It's a strange ballet of kindness and irritation, choreographed by exhaustion and the faint hope that tomorrow's mess will be less bland. The ship's heart and essential pump gets fouled by a slick of oil, hissing like a dragon with a sore throat, forcing the engineers into a frantic, grease-splattered ballet of wrenches and prey-filled shouts. A sailor, his leg mangled from a near miss, is hoisted onto a makeshift stretcher and whisked toward the sickbay, his breath a ragged drumbeat against the night's hush. Night watches now taste of ghosts. Every ripple of water hints at a Japanese plane swooping like a vengeful seagull, and the men brace for surprise raids that arrive with the faint whine of engines and the smell of burnt cordite. Small harassing attacks pepper the darkness, leaving the deck slick with foam and the crew's nerves frayed like old fishing line. Yet in the margins of his log, Reed notes that the terror is tempered by the rhythmic clank of guns and the steady, almost comforting, thrum of the ship's wounded heart. The Riptide slipped into the guarded anchorage like a tired dog finding its bowl, her steel hull sighing as the reef's soft sand kissed her bottom. Lanterns blinked amber over the dock, casting jittery shadows that danced to the rhythm of clanking chains and distant drum beats from the shore. The smell of hot diesel mixed with the salty tang of seaweed, while a chorus of gulls shouted gossip about the war's latest memes. "May the force be with our torpedoes," one squawked, daring a grin. Reed watched the convoy's supply boats pull alongside, their tires squelching in the mud as men offloaded crates that smelled of canned beans and hope. He logged the moment, noting the contrast between the calm harbor and the firefights that still echoed in his ears like a bad karaoke solo. When the last convoy truck rolled away, Reed's pen dragged across the pages, weighing victory against the cost in a way that would make a veteran accountant weep. The men stepped ashore to a thin, grateful welcome. A handful of islanders holding bamboo torches, a few battered banners, and a plate of grilled fish that tasted like triumph seasoned with salt and sweat. The air was thick with the clamor of drums and the distant rumble of artillery that had ceased, leaving an uneasy quiet that felt like the universe had pressed pause. Their boots sank into the soft sand, each step echoing the hollow thud of a drumbeat that marked both arrival and departure. Reed wrote, "We made it," but the price tag was written in sand and blood, his humor a thin veil over the ache in his chest. Back aboard, the crew dove into repairs with the enthusiasm of kids unwrapping presents, except the gifts were steel plates and rivet guns, and the wrapping paper smelled like oil. Hayes slipped a battered bottle of rum into his pocket and raised a short, private toast in the mess, his words slurring, "To the dead who are finally getting a proper burial and the living who still have to write thank you notes to Mom." Keene, polishing a dented rail, swore a solemn oath to keep watch where the fallen once stood, promising their ghosts would never get a free pass. Letters to home stateside fluttered out of the hatchways, each envelope brimming with exaggerated tales of heroism, and the occasional joke about how the ship's galley could rival a nuclear kitchen. A small ceremony followed, flowers yellow as the sunrise over Guadalcanal, being scattered over the water, their petals swirling like slow-motion confetti for the lost. The wind-sculpted atoll rose from the sea like a jagged crown, its coral reef snapping at any careless boat. Lieutenant Thomas Hale, a taciturn Australian with a mustache that could hide a secret code, slipped ashore with Miri, the nimble Solomon Islander who could navigate jungle paths blindfolded. Together they tucked their makeshift shelter between palm trunks that swayed with the scent of salt and rotting leaf litter. Every sunrise painted the lagoon a bruised mauve, while distant Japanese destroyers cut the horizon like a razor. Their orders were simple on paper: observe, encode, transmit, but the reality was a tightrope walk over a pit of hungry sharks. By night they cobbled a radio from salvaged parts, its antenna a crooked contraption of twisted wire and a coconut husk bracket. Miri taught Hale the brittle cipher they called Sago, a code as fragile as the breakfast grain it was named after, where a single misplaced vowel could turn supply into Sphinx. On a palm-scented map, they scratched the locations of hidden caches, each X marked with a doodle of a grinning shark for good luck. The radio crackled with static that sounded like 100 angry cicadas, while the ocean hissed beneath their feet, reminding them that any misstep could drown the signal. Still, they sent their first burst of dots and dashes, hoping the words would ride the wind faster than a gossiping war correspondent. The night the Japanese dropped a flare, the sky erupted in a garish orange that painted the reef in a horror movie glow. Hale ducked behind a mangrove, heart thudding like a war drum, while Miri whispered a prayer to the sea gods and tossed a few bananas to distract the guard dogs. Just as the flare faded, a distant submarine's wake thumped the water, a friendly ghost that smelled faintly of diesel and burnt coffee. The crew on board bobbed a cheerio with a signal lamp, a wink that felt like a secret handshake between strangers. They barely managed to slip the next report through the static, a triumph as sweet as finding a fresh coconut on a scorching day. The moonless sky over the Solomons pressed black and cold, as if the heavens had ripped the night's blanket. A thunderous roar split the silence when a fast-moving Japanese convoy, larger than any Hale had ever spotted, slammed into the horizon. Hale felt the weight of a single radio burst like a live grenade in his palm. One spark could save the Allied fleet or doom it to a watery grave. The convoy's diesel belched, the water frothed, and enemy patrol boats began to circle like sharks smelling blood. Somewhere behind the mangroves, Hale's heart hammered, knowing the next minutes would write history or a tragedy. He and Miri scrambled for coconut poles, banana leaf rope, and a coil of salvaged wire that smelled faintly of salt and rust. With trembling hands, they wedged the poles into the soft sand, fashioning a crooked antenna that resembled a badly assembled alien antenna from a 1950s sci-fi flick. The static hissed like a swarm of angry cicadas as they keyed the transmitter, each crackle a reminder that the enemy could hear every squeak. They fed the encoded coordinates, latitude, longitude, convoy composition, into the machine, the Morse dots dancing like fireflies in a hurricane. The salty wind tugged at Miri's hair, and Hale whispered a prayer to any god who'd listen, hoping the signal would cut through the night's deafening quiet. Just as the final dot slipped into the ether, Japanese shore parties surged onto the islet, their boots thudding on the wet sand like an unwanted drum solo. Hale ripped the transmitter's delicate guts, tiny vacuum tubes and gleaming filaments, and shoved them into a hollowed-out coconut, burying the evidence with a grin that turned bitter as the seaweed stuck to his hands. Meanwhile, Miri ignited a series of smoky fires, coaxing the flames to curl into grotesque shapes that looked more like a 1980s rave than a war signal. The smoke billowed, painting the night in orange and black, confusing the Japanese scouts who squinted through the haze, thinking they'd stumbled onto a ceremonial dance. Their shouts rose, "What the heck is that?" And the inevitable irony was that the greatest diversion was a makeshift bonfire party under fire. When the last bursts of Morse faded into the night, the jungle seemed to inhale, as if the very trees sensed we had just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. But the triumph was short-lived. Japanese patrols, now slick as oil on a frying pan, doubled their sweeps along the ragged shoreline. Our hidden shore cache, once a neat wooden trunk brimming with canned beans and a battered enigma-like codebook, had been ransacked, the lid left swinging like a broken gate. The codebook itself vanished, maybe stolen by a curious crab or, more likely, a keen-eyed scout from the enemy. Hale and I slipped inland, guided by a spider web of buried tins, coconut husk markers, and the whispered directions of island kin who knew every palm frond shadow. Food grew thin as a plot twist, and a fever that smelled of vinegar and rust settled into my ribs, making every breath feel like chewing sandpaper. Miri, who could still laugh at my pangs, stared at the dwindling stash of dried fish and asked, "Who do we feed first, the boys or the children?" The choice gnawed at us like a toothache, a moral crucible where each life weighed as heavily as a 2-pound bomb. We found the village elder trembling behind a bamboo fence, his eyes darting like a cat on a hot tin roof, muttering about a stranger who had slipped a knife into his soup. Rumors of an informant slithered through the thatch, and I caught Miri's smile flicker, part dread, part the kind of nervous grin you see when a spider lands on your shoulder, and you realize it's not poisonous. That night we trekked the Coral Channel, a moonlit razor-thin path where sea sponges hissed and the water looked like liquid glass stained with blood. We tied down a makeshift raft of bamboo and oil drums, praying the currents wouldn't swallow us like a bad sequel. To mask our approach, we lit coded lanterns, each flicker a secret Morse pulse that only Hale could read, like a firefly-based Wi-Fi. When the Japanese patrol lights skimmed the far bank, we slipped behind a tangle of mangroves, leaving behind false trails of broken shells and broken promises. Back on the island, we scavenged a busted radio, a broken antenna from a downed Japanese plane, and with a lot of cursing and a dash of ingenuity, we cobbled together a transmitter that sounded less like a radio and more like a wounded walrus. The night air over the Solomons tasted of salt and gunpowder, and for the first time in months, the distant thrum of Allied engines grew louder than the Japanese patrol boats. Hale's coded missives, whispered over a crackling crystal set, finally clicked into place, sinking the guerrilla scouts with a looming aerial strike that lit up the horizon like a fireworks show at a superhero finale. Jungle foliage shivered as patrols in battered boats slipped between mangrove teeth, sweeping the islands with the meticulous cruelty of a house cleaner after a wild party. Even the cicadas seemed to cheer, their chorus a nervous drum roll for the Allies' sudden momentum. Hale and Miri were a mess of mud, blood, and determination, looking like two extras from a war film who'd forgotten the makeup crew. With a ragged laugh, Miri tapped out the last coded relay on a salvaged typewriter, the keys clacking like a frantic Morse code version of a video game cheat code. The message slipped through the static, arranging a covert extraction for the most vulnerable villagers, a frail old woman clutching a wooden amulet and a boy whose shoes were holes big enough to swallow a palm fruit. Meanwhile, they hid the remaining caches behind a thicket of coconut palms, sealing them with sand as if the beach were a giant, gritty safe deposit box. The diary's ink grew thick as the days wore on, each entry a mix of triumph and grief. Some comrades had vanished like mist over the lagoon, their absence a hollow echo in the night. The final secret, a string of numbers that had saved lives, was stapled into the inner lining of a weather-beaten chest, a humble hiding place that would make any spy novelist blush with envy. Miri tucked the chest beneath a rusted ship's hull, the metal groaning like an old man settling into his chair, and stepped back to watch an Allied destroyer slice through the dawn, its silhouette dissolving into pink sky like a magician's disappearing act. A fragile hope flickered in her chest, as delicate as the fireflies that now danced around the wreckage.